The Grand Canyon is like a book that tells the story of Earth. By reading this book, we can peer deep into the annals of our ancient planet. This book can help us understand how and why our planet looks the way it does today, how it looked in the past, and what it might look like in the future. It can help us understand the history of life and death on our planet, everything from the simplest single-celled organisms to our earliest tetrapod ancestors. From the diversification of life to the devastation of mass extinctions. We can see ancient oceans and primordial forests and bygone deserts. This book can teach us so much about our journey on this little blue dot we call home. And we can see it all in the Grand Canyon. So, if the Grand Canyon is like a book, then the individual layers of rock within it are like the pages to that book. And if you can read these pages, you can read this book. So today, I will be your librarian on this geologic journey through the layers of the Grand Canyon, and I will help you learn to read the pages that together tell the story of Earth. My name is Cameron, and this is National Park Diaries. I tell stories from the world's protected places. They are fun, I hope, meaningful, educational stories about national parks, public lands, and protected areas. Today's story is about Grand Canyon, and it's about geology, but I cover lots of topics from ecology to biology to natural history to regular history and everything in between. Pretty much, if it has to do with a protected area of some kind, I will talk about it. So if you are interested in that, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell thing so you don't miss an episode. I also have a Patreon where you can get 3 extra videos a month plus access to my Discord. So check that out if you are so inclined. That's patreon.com/National Park Diaries. All right, let's dive into the layers of the Grand Canyon. Because as I said, understanding the individual layers of the Grand Canyon is a way for us, as puny humans who have only been around on this planet for basically no time at all, geologically speaking, it's a way for us to make sense of the history of our world, to understand where we came from and how we got here and why our world looks the way it does today. Rocks help us understand all this because they're like little snapshots into various periods of Earth's history. We can see and touch and feel these rocks, and thus we can see and touch and feel that history. One layer holds the clues to things that happened millions of years ago, another layer hundreds of millions, and still another layer billions of years. It's all laid out for us here in a grand display at the Grand Canyon. Now, before we get started on this tour, let's go over a couple of ground rules. For one, we're going to be talking about generalizations here. We're going to be talking about the main layers of the Grand Canyon, as well as our best guess for their relative ages and the composition of the rocks that make them up. That doesn't mean that there aren't other layers, or layers within layers, or sublayers, or rocks of different ages within those layers, or different types of rocks within those layers. There are. The geology of the Grand Canyon is very complex, and my goal here is to simplify things so that we're not here for literal hours, but also so that you can get your head around the big picture, the broader context of what these layers of the Grand Canyon are able to tell us about our planet's past and not get so bogged down in the details. Next, we're going to be moving from the bottom of the canyon to the top, oldest rocks to youngest. There's a principle in geology called the principle of superposition, which is just a fancy way of saying that rocks form in layers, and that those layers are formed by laying down younger rocks on top of older rocks. So the youngest rocks in the Grand Canyon will be towards the top, while the oldest are at the bottom. Again, we're going to start at the bottom. And finally, in order to bring some sort of structure to this discussion, we're going to talk about these rocks at different scales of geologic time. Geologic time is broken down into these divisions and subdivisions and more subdivisions, and the different breaks between divisions signify major events in Earth's history as evidenced through the fossil record. So we're going to start with big divisions and work our way down to smaller divisions, talking about layers and groups of layers at different timescales depending on what makes the most sense. This will become more clear as we get into it. Also, geologic time is like inaccessibly long and pretty much impossible for our little lizard brains to truly comprehend. So I'm going to be using a handy analogy that the Park Service uses, which equates the whole of geologic time with a single year of our time. So in this analogy, the formation of the Earth would occur on January 1st, and our modern day is at the very end of the year. To give you an example and probably send you into an existential crisis, the period of time we are living through right now is called the Holocene epoch, which started roughly 12,000 years ago. In this analogy, the Holocene epoch would have started on December 31st at 11:59 p.m. All right, let's get started. So the first and oldest layer of the Grand Canyon we're going to talk about are the Vishnu Basement rocks. They come from a period of Earth's history known as Precambrian time, but more specifically, a time period known as the Proterozoic Eon, which runs from roughly 2.5 billion to 540 million years ago. In our calendar analogy, this eon runs roughly from June 16th through November 19th. It covers almost half of the time that Earth has existed. This is an ancient period of time. We are talking about the very beginnings of the formation of the continents. And I'm not talking about the present day locations of the continents. I'm talking about the literal formation of the rock that makes up what are today considered continents. I told you this time period is ancient. We are also going to see the first evidence of oxygen in our atmosphere at this time, and life really only exists as very simple single-celled organisms. Later on in Precambrian time, that abundance of oxygen would allow simple multicellular organisms to evolve, and at the very end of this time period, the first things that we could consider animals will appear. The fossil record, though, is very sparse here because, again, there just isn't a lot of life to speak of. This is the time period when the Vishnu Basement rocks are starting to form. They are anywhere from 1.6 to 1.8 billion years old, yes, with a B. Also, by the time these Vishnu Basement rocks are forming, Earth has already been around for 3 billion years. These rocks trace their origins to the very beginnings of what would become the North American continent and are actually part of an ancient mountain chain. See, as this mountain chain was forming, these rocks were actually pushed and crumpled down deep into the Earth's surface, where they were subjected to intense amounts of heat and pressure, so much so that they actually changed from volcanic igneous rocks into metamorphic rocks. Then, those mountains, over millions of years, eroded away, leaving these Vishnu Basement rocks, the primordial guts of those mountains, exposed. Eventually, new sediment was deposited on top of the Vishnu Basement rocks, forming all of the layers we see above them in the Grand Canyon today, and which we'll talk about in a minute. All right, the next layer up on our tour is the Grand Canyon supergroup. It's technically made up of a bunch of smaller layers, but we're just going to talk about them all together here. Believe it or not, these rocks still formed during the Proterozoic Eon during the Precambrian times. Only they formed more recently, about 1.2 billion to 740 million years ago, which puts them in that October-November timeframe in our calendar year analogy. This is the time, again, when there's just not a lot of complex life to speak of. We'll start to see the beginnings of multicellular life, but the fossil record is also pretty sparse here. Unlike the Vishnu Basement rocks, however, the rocks of the Grand Canyon supergroup are sedimentary, which means they were deposited as sediments, in this case by a large sea, before being solidified into rocks. They are not volcanic, like igneous rocks, and have not been subjected to high heat and pressure, which would have turned them into metamorphic rocks. They are sedimentary. Now, there is something peculiar about the Grand Canyon supergroup. You might notice that they are tilted. See, there's another principle in geology called the principle of original horizontality, which is just a fancy way of saying that sediments are deposited more or less horizontally, and that if they are tilted, like the Grand Canyon supergroup, this occurred after they became rocks. In this case, the Grand Canyon supergroup was subjected to some sort of tectonic activity, causing them to be uplifted and become angled. Now, remember that everything up to this point was in that Proterozoic eon, that Precambrian time. Not a lot of life to speak of, very little in the fossil record. At this point, above the Vishnu Basement rocks and above the Grand Canyon supergroup, we are going to be dealing with rocks from the Paleozoic era, a whole new classification of geologic time. We're going to start to see some more complex life and more things appear in the fossil record, which we'll talk about when we get to them. But before that, as we're traveling up from the bottom of the Grand Canyon, as we pass into the Paleozoic era, we're going to pass a line called the Great Unconformity. In some places in the Grand Canyon, 1 billion years of Earth's history is missing as we cross this line. Essentially, what has happened here is that those 1 billion years have already been eroded away. Rocks used to be there, but were eroded away, and then the new rocks, the ones we see today, were deposited on top of them. Only they're much younger than the older rocks below them because, again, the rocks that should fill in that age gap have already been eroded. If we go back to our book analogy, this would be like ripping pages out of the book. We can't read those pages, and thus we can't understand this part of the story. The Grand Canyon is actually filled with unconformities like this, places where there's a gap in the geologic record where the story is missing, only they aren't as large as this one, which is why it's called the Great Unconformity. You'll notice these, though, as we talk about dates higher up in the canyon. All right, let's read on. Okay, we've now moved into the Paleozoic era, crossing over the Great Unconformity. All of the rocks we talk about from here on out will be from this era. Because of that, and because there are more things appearing in the fossil record, we can actually further divide geologic time into even smaller units. In this case, we can break down the Paleozoic era into smaller subdivisions called periods, which will make it easier to understand everything we're about to talk about. This first set of Paleozoic rocks we're going to talk about are from the Cambrian Period, occurring between 541 and 485 million years ago. That's November 19th through 23rd on our annual calendar. Now, the Cambrian Period is really important in the history of Earth because it's where we see something called the Cambrian explosion. If you'll recall, from the end of the Proterozoic eon, we were just starting to see the beginnings of complex multicellular life. Well, here in the Cambrian, multicellular life starts to rapidly diversify, and we start to see things like shelled marine invertebrates, think trilobites, sponges, brachiopods, and even primitive jawless fish. It's one of the greatest periods of evolutionary activity in Earth's history. Despite that, there's still no terrestrial life, though. Here in the Cambrian period, life on Earth is concentrated in the oceans. And speaking of oceans, the oldest layer of Cambrian rock in the Grand Canyon, the Tapete Sandstone, was formed with the help of an ocean. Not quite in the ocean like we'll see with some other layers, but more of a near-shore sandy beach type environment, hence the sandstone. This layer is about 525 million years old. The thickness of the Tapete Sandstone actually varies throughout the length of the Grand Canyon, because the ocean was advancing and retreating throughout this time period, and thus more or less deposition would have been occurring depending on how far inland the ocean came. Okay, moving on to the next Cambrian layer, the Bright Angel Shale, roughly 515 million years old. As far as life and fossils go, again, we're still in the Cambrian period, so there's not much difference in terms of the overall landscape of life on Earth. But, as its name implies, the Bright Angel Shale is made up of, well, shale, plus some fine-grained sandstone. That's what gives it that pretty greenish-purple color. It's going to be laid down as that ancient sea continues to advance inland, making this more of a shallow marine layer than a near-shore one. This layer is highly erodible, and so you'll often see it form nice slopes rather than cliffs. And finally, the youngest Cambrian layer in the Grand Canyon is the Muav limestone, MUAV, roughly 505 million years old. That sea has continued to advance inland, making this a deeper marine layer, hence the limestone, which forms from the shells of dead marine animals. All right, as we continue our journey up and out of the Grand Canyon, the next rocks we come across are going to be from the Devonian Period, which lasted from roughly 419 to 358 million years ago, or November 28th through December 3rd on our annual calendar. The world during this time is still a marine-dominated environment, and a great diversity of fish appear at this time. We already had jawless fishes, but we now start to see fish with jaws. So start to see sharks and the ancestors of what are called today ray-finned fishes, which are pretty much the fish you're probably picturing in your head right now. Cod, tuna, clownfish, I don't know, fish. But while this version of Earth is dominated by marine life, land plants have also arrived to the party, and as they continue to reduce their dependence on water for reproduction, they begin to develop thicker stems and better ways to move nutrients around, leading to the evolution of wood and eventually forests. That's right, the Devonian period is the first place we start to see forests appear in the fossil record. We're also going to see things like insects and spiders appear for the first time, as well as a little group of animal known as tetrapods, which would give rise to all modern terrestrial vertebrates. Now, back in what would become the Grand Canyon, there's only one layer of rock from this time period. It's known as the Temple Butte Formation and is roughly 385 million years old. The sea is continuing to advance in this area, and so the Temple Butte Formation is, again, primarily limestone. But it's not a very thick layer, as it's mainly seen in old river channels. As the sea advanced and covered these ancient riverbeds, the deposits of the Temple Butte Formation settled over those beds and deposited the limestone we see today. Next up, our tour takes us to rocks formed during the Mississippian Period, which lasted from roughly 358 to 323 million years ago, or December 3rd through 6th in our calendar year. You may be more familiar with the terminology of the Carboniferous Period, but here in North America, we split up the Carboniferous Period into older Mississippian and younger Pennsylvanian periods, just because it makes more sense based on the rock layers found here. Anyway, here in North America, everything is pretty much underwater, but on land, those tetrapods have evolved into the first amphibians, and by this time have actually rapidly diversified. Thus, the Carboniferous, which remember includes both the Mississippian and the Pennsylvanian, is called the Age of Amphibians. The collection of life on Earth here is really starting to include some groups we're all familiar with now. In terms of the Grand Canyon, well, two different rock layers are formed during this time. The oldest is the Redwall limestone, dating to about 340 million years ago. As its name implies, this layer is, again, mostly made of limestone, again, laid down in a marine environment from the shells of dead sea creatures. But we are getting a little more shallow at this time, the sea is retreating, and we'll see a different composition of rock here because of it. Now, contrary to its name, though, the Redwall limestone isn't actually red. The rock itself is more of a grayish color, but the iron from the layers above it has seeped down and stained those rocks that rusty red color. The younger of the Grand Canyon's Mississippian layers is the Surprise Canyon Formation, laid down roughly 320 million years ago. This is, again, a marine layer, but again, that sea is continuing to get more shallow, and we'll see a layer made mostly of shale. Like the Temple Butte Formation, the Surprise Canyon Formation was also laid down in old riverbeds and isn't as thick. In fact, this layer is very rare to see in the Grand Canyon because it has been heavily, and in some places completely, eroded. Okay, as we talked about, the second half of the Carboniferous period here in North America is known as the Pennsylvanian Period. And this is the next layer of Grand Canyon rocks that we'll climb through on our way to the top. The Pennsylvanian period lasted from roughly 323 to 298 million years ago, or December 6th through 8th in our annual calendar. Unlike the Mississippian period, which again saw North America covered mostly in water, the Pennsylvanian sees North America dry out a bit and become more terrestrial environment. Worldwide, this is the terrifying time when you would have found dragonflies and cockroaches that were several feet long, not inches. The world was filled with lush, swampy forests and ferns as tall as trees. On the animal front, we're still in the age of amphibians, but those amphibians have started to figure out how to decouple themselves from reproducing in water by developing the amniotic egg, which eventually gives rise to the evolution of reptiles during this time. And as far as Grand Canyon rocks go, one layer formed during this time period, although it's more like a couple of layers and its formation actually dips into the Permian period a bit, but we'll talk about it here. That layer is known as the Supai group, dating from roughly 315 to 285 million years ago. This layer is really made up of 4 separate layers because they all had different depositional environments as the sea continued to advance and retreat. You'll find limestones, shales, and sandstones here, all deposited in marine, estuarine, and terrestrial environments. It's a diverse layer and really goes to show us how different this part of the world has looked at different points in its history. Okay, we have reached the final time period in which the rocks of the Grand Canyon were deposited. It is known as the Permian Period and lasted from 298 to 251 million years ago, or December 8th through December 12th on our annual calendar. This is the world of Pangaea, that most famous of supercontinents. Pangaea was surrounded by a world ocean known as Panthalassa, which that name just terrifies me for some reason. The world is hot and dry, and that amniotic egg is really working wonders as our ancient ancestors continue to rely less and less on water for reproduction and become the dominant form of terrestrial life. This is the time period where we see the lineages that gave rise to the dinosaurs first appear. Also, at the end of the Permian period, the most devastating mass extinction event the world has ever known occurs, wiping out 90% of all life on planet Earth. But hey, let's talk about rocks. There are 4 layers of the Grand Canyon deposited during this time. The oldest and bottommost is the Hermit Formation, 280 million years old. It contains mostly sandstone and siltstone and was formed as part of a dry, broad coastal plain. It's pretty erodible, so you'll recognize it as a slopey layer and not a cliffy layer. It's also pumped full of iron dioxide, giving it that deep red, rusty color. Above that is the Coconino Sandstone, 275 million years old. It's a very conspicuous white layer near the top of the canyon. It's dominated by, of course, sandstone, because when this layer was deposited, the area was a giant, massive dune field, just one big old pile of sand in which winds blew in from the north and deposited a bunch of sand that eventually hardened into rocks, which we now call sandstone, and which is now part of the Grand Canyon. All right, moving on. Above that is the Toroweap Formation, 273 million years old. Back to a marine environment for this one, but probably pretty shallow and advancing and retreating several times over the course of this layer's deposition. That's why you'll see all kinds of rocks here, from sandstone to limestone to gypsum and a bunch more. And then, finally, we have reached the top, the layer we stand on when we visit the Grand Canyon, when we peer out over its rim into this vast chasm of rock and time. This is the layer we stand on. It's called the Kaibab Formation, and it was formed 270 million years ago. This land is once again covered by an ocean, meaning the Kaibab Formation is dominated by limestone. But think about that for a minute. There you are, standing on top of the Grand Canyon, standing on top of 270 million years of Earth's history, standing on top of rocks that were formed when Pangaea was still a thing, when a vast ocean enclosed almost the entire planet, when the world was so incredibly different from today that it's almost impossible for us to comprehend. And then imagine leaving that rim and making the return journey back down to the bottom of the Grand Canyon, passing through layer upon layer of earth, diving deeper and deeper into the annals of geologic history, revealing the creatures and climates and conditions of that prehistoric book. You can now read this book. You can now look into the past and see what was happening on this planet millions and billions of years ago, and how that influenced what we see today. You can touch those things, you can feel them, you can understand this story, the story of Earth. I think that's pretty cool, and I think it's even cooler that that story, that book, is protected as one of the world's premier national parks. If you want to hear more stories about national parks and protected areas around the world, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the little bell so you don't miss an episode. Also, I don't want to toot my own horn, but I think my Patreon is a pretty cool place to hang out. I run a book club over there, I do AMAs, behind the scenes videos, and I have a Discord. Truly, this operation, National Park Diaries, every video I make is fan funded. I stand on the shoulders of a tremendous community, and my patrons are a big part of that, so huge shout out to them. If that sounds like something you'd be interested in supporting, you can head over to patreon.com/nationalparkdiaries. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.